You're going to leave the chamber. Can you do so quickly and quietly, please? And I call David Rowlands to talk on the topic that he has chosen. David.
In plenary a few days before recess, the First Minister said that leaving Europe would raise the cost of food for us in Wales. Well, perhaps the next time you shred the cabbage for Sunday lunch or dice the carrots, you should spare a thought about the human cost of putting these and many other products on your table. I want you to picture a scene at a BP petrol station. It's 4 a.m. on a cold January morning. The sky is still black, but the garage attendant has already been serving migrant workers for an hour or more. By 4:15, the silent figures from across the town had become a steady flow. Summoned by a text message the previous evening, they huddle on the forecourt, waiting for a succession of vehicles that would take them to the factories or fields around the area, where they would be put to work for 10 to 12 hours. A female police officer is watching from her office in the police station, which, coincidentally, overlooks the petrol station. She moved to this station because she has special expertise on organised crime. She has observed the same scene being played out regularly for the last few months. She recognises this as a criminal gang-led activity, but is powerless to stop it. The sophisticated methods used by modern-day criminal gangs make prosecution very difficult. Victims are almost impossible to recruit as witnesses, far too scared to give evidence against these gangland bosses. This is quite understandable, given that the local area has seen a spate of apparent suicides amongst young East Europeans over the last few years. 3 were found hanging, and with one there was a message daubed on a nearby wall. Translated, it read, "The dead cannot testify." These were by no means the only deaths amongst the local European community, East European community. The remains of a 17-year-old Lithuanian girl were found 5 months after her disappearance. A Lithuanian courier had been burnt to death as he slept in his van, and all this in an area where murder had been virtually unknown a decade ago. Most of us are unaware of this brutal parallel universe which often underpins our mainstream economy. But there are areas of the country where it is highly visible. The parliamentary constituency where the scene described above took place voted overwhelmingly in a 2017 survey to reaffirm their desire to leave the EU, recognising that mass immigration from Eastern Europe was fundamentally changing their community. So if the police are aware of these operations, why are we not seeing large-scale prosecutions? Well, there are 2 main reasons: the sophistication of the gangland operations and the sheer scale of the problem. The police simply do not have the manpower to cope with a huge explosion in the exploitation of mainly migrant workers, which has occurred over the last decade, due almost exclusively to the policy of open borders. The situation was vastly exacerbated with the accession of the East European states to the EU. Estimates of the likely numbers expected to come to the UK, often quoted as just tens of thousands. These have proved to be totally inadequate. We now have more than 4 million from Eastern Europe in the UK. These are official figures and mask a huge underbelly of illegal immigrants who, being unknown to the authorities, are ripe for the worst sort of exploitation. I said the criminal gangs have become very sophisticated in their operations. Some examples are witnessed in the fact that they take their victims to various bank branches in the surrounding area and supply them with false documents to open accounts, such things as utility bills, passports and identities. They then give the gang master's home address for the delivery of account correspondence on the pretence that the migrant can then claim benefits and seek work. This allows the gangs to hijack the victim's identity and obtain PIN numbers, etc. They will open a string of these accounts over which they have complete control. They then use them to launder money, obtain loans, etc. The gangs control huge numbers of these migrants, either trafficking them into the country themselves or helping new arrivals with small loans, form filling, etc. Many who do not speak the language find these tremendously helpful and so easily fall into the hands of the criminal gangs. There is also, of course, the promise of jobs. The gangs will become the agents for work for the migrants, but the jobs given will, with the deductions taken by the gangs for such things as accommodation, transport, etc., will not pay sufficiently to repay the loans, and these unfortunates find themselves on the dreaded debt books kept by the gang masters. From then on, they become virtual slaves, working simply to pay their upkeep and their debts. Women who fall into the trap of this manufactured debt are usually given two options: travel to India or Pakistan to take part in a fake marriage, for which the gang masters will be paid upwards of £1,500, or be put to work as a prostitute. There is also a great deal of evidence to attest that far more gruesome manifestation of migrant exploitation, where organs for transplant are harvested as a means of debt repayment. What has become increasingly clear in my research into this subject is the deep hypocrisy which is displayed at the heart of the rhetoric used, particularly from those parties which profess to care about the working classes. And let us be clear here, it is almost exclusively the working classes who are being exploited in this way. Yet the political left constantly claim mass, uncontrolled immigration is not only desirable, but is essential to the economy, and that open borders has a very positive effect on the UK. This rhetoric completely ignores the true reality of mass immigration and the resultant misery it causes to thousands of migrant workers. It promotes a business model that depends on a constant churn of workers to carry out the jobs that are underpaid and insecure at best, but are all too often dirty, dangerous and degrading as well. This scenario requires not just mass immigration, but mass immigration without end, since it is only the newly arrived, being both desperate and vulnerable, which can supply the fodder for continuing exploitation. As this exploitation is usually carried out by big business, be it legal or illegal, it beggars belief that the Labour Party still promotes an open-door policy on immigration. The scene played out in that BP station each day is not simply about immigration or the human cost of cheap goods, or even a few isolated rogue operators. It is the manifestation of a profound social and economic change that has come about in little more than 2 decades, and which is the direct result of uncontrolled immigration. Here I have documented evidence and some convictions for those involved in the sex trade exploitation of immigrants. These are from The Guardian and the BBC, outlining some appalling instances. What both of these media giants failed to do is to identify the root cause of these ills: mass immigration, where the loss of border controls means no one knows who or how people come to this country. There are those who contend that such controls will not eradicate the problem. their argument is shown to have no substance. This sort of exploitation was almost unknown before the opening of our borders and was usually in the hands of a small, localised underground network. It is now a huge international operation controlled by multinational gangs who are making hundreds of millions of pounds annually through this human misery. In the few instances where police have had success with prosecuting these criminal gangs, we may pause to ponder what is the cost of these prosecutions. Translation costs in our courts have now reached staggering proportions. It is said that a hugely disproportionate number of migrants now occupy our prisons. It has been worked out that if the propensity of foreign-born nationals to commit crime based on representation in our prisons were reflected in the indigenous population as a whole, occupancy of our prisons would be near 120,000, not the 84,000 we now have. And let us not forget, there is overwhelming evidence to indicate that crime by ethnic minorities is often overlooked by authorities. We can also remind ourselves that the prison system is the last resort of the justice system and only occurs if serious or multiple crime is involved. It goes without saying that the vast majority of crime is dealt with as non-custodial sentences, such things as community sentences, electronic tagging, etc. So we must add the cost of monitoring these interventions to the expense of non-UK nationals' crime, again amounting to an enormous cost to the public purse. This again does not include the vast sums of money leaving the UK, both legally and illegally, from migrant workers and the criminal gangs who exploit them. One wonders if any of these factors are taken into account when the economic benefits of mass immigration are being calculated. I very much doubt it. And note, I have not mentioned benefit payments. Though the police have had some limited success in the prosecutions of these criminal gangs, there is only one way to end this appalling exploitation of our fellow human beings, and it is to end mass immigration, take control of our borders, deal favourably with those people who are already here and being exploited, and have a comprehensive crackdown on those engaged in such exploitation, with severe penalties, including automatic deportation for those involved. So regardless of the First Minister's comments, if this puts a few pence on the cost of the food on my plate, I, for one, am willing to pay it.